Hello, dear friends. The new consciousness that we speak of often at this channel can also be referred to as Christ consciousness, and many people know it as that. This actually is can be very helpful for us um, to think of it as Christ consciousness because it gives us a certain framework for understanding what uh, what the new consciousness of man is and how it can come to pass. The Christ consciousness is um, is a name that goes back very far. The Christ is actually a state of spiritual being that was first envisioned thousands of years ago by humankind. And most specifically, it was developed, this idea of the Christ was developed by ancient Jewish scholars and prophets. They envisioned a state of consciousness. They envisioned a state of being that was a higher spiritual state than what mankind was moving in. And the defining characteristics of this state had to do with basically reversing many of the aspects of our present state of consciousness, which we can call Adamic consciousness, of reversing those aspects of Adamic consciousness that tend to hold us back, keep us stuck, and um, cause us to live life in a greatly reduced capacity for what we're capable of. To have many problems in life, to have many challenges and difficulties, and so forth. So ancient Jewish prophets and scholars envisioned this state of being that mankind was and is capable of, that we have the potential for this, all men. But what happened over time with this concept of the Christ is that Adamic consciousness took hold of it and made it into um, a figure, a singular human figure of that had all the characteristics of this state, but that it would not be um, once this singular figure came on the scene, it would not be something that was considered for part of the potential for all mankind. Rather, it would be this singular figure's title, and um, that this would be such a great display of human potentiality that this figure would actually be worthy of worship instead of showing us this possibility for each one of us. And this was a direct outworking of Adamic consciousness, which tends to take all of these kinds of ideas and to reduce them to um, superstitious, ignorant kind of uh, viewpoints that um, don't don't do justice to these concepts whatsoever. But originally, the idea of the Christ was that it was a state of being, a state of a spiritual state of being that mankind, all of us, can attain to, and so let's look then at exactly what the Christ state involves. Um, because we have now come back to the place, we've evolved enough in consciousness to come to the place where we can realize that this is not a singular superstitious uh, figure, this Christ figure that is worthy of worship. Rather, it's a state in that all of us can attain to. We've evolved in consciousness enough to realize this and to see it as a real potentiality. And so basically, the Christ is a state that each one of us can become. And in fact, there is an ancient Jewish myth or tradition that anybody can be the Messiah. And this was something that most people thought was a quaint saying, but it's actually true. Basically, the Christ, the Messiah, is a state in which Adamic consciousness is reversed. Adamic consciousness, as we've talked about a lot in other videos, Adamic consciousness is defined in many ways, but in just two or three prominent ways that we can define Adamic consciousness. One is the sense of separation that we all feel. And out of this sense of separation comes the instinct to fend for ourselves using our human strength. In other words, we see ourselves as separate, we see ourselves as cut off from any help, and each one of us, we see ourselves as an island of self-sufficiency. And this view of ourselves gives rise to the instinct to fend for ourselves. And that's why our society has become described as Darwinian, the survival of the fittest, the prospering of the fittest and the strongest. And there's another aspect to Adamic consciousness that is very prominent, and that is the knowledge of good and evil. Or this is not just good and evil, this is actually a mental functioning in which we are very aware of dualities. We're very aware that everything in life has its dualistic side, its flip side. But the knowledge of good and evil is important to focus on because this is a part of Adamic consciousness that has made human life very difficult. Because what happened is that when we became conscious of evil, we also, in essence, we brought evil into existence, into being. And once that happened, we could make the choice at any point to invoke the power of evil. And so that's really been very much the story of this age of Adam, is that men have been powerless to resist the temptation to not just have the knowledge of evil, but to act on it, to invoke its power, to try to um, um, use evil to make their way through life. Um, when we think of many of man's worst qualities, such as greed and lust and power hunger and hatred, when we think of these things, they all have come into existence. They've all colored human character by this particular path of not being able to resist the temptation of evil. So, this is the state of consciousness that we've all been in for this entire year, for this entire age. And it is called Adamic consciousness, aptly, after the biblical figure Adam. Christ consciousness basically reverses this entire framework. It begins with the sense of separation, and any human being can reverse this, but it's very difficult for us because it takes consciousness, it takes conscious awareness, and it takes spiritual focus to be able to even know that we're trapped in this sense of separation. So we are all capable of reversing this, but we all have to first become aware of the fact that we have this sense of separation and that this has been handed down to us, and it's basically a genetic situation that we find ourselves in, that we all have this um, feeling that we are cut off and on our own. The Christ is a man or a woman who has been able to break the power of this spell of separation, to to basically cause it to disappear, to just call it for what it is and rebuke it, refuse to simply act out on this sense anymore. And we can all do this, and basically what it takes is a very high spiritual state in which we are able to see that we are reconciled to God and always have been, that we are reconciled to one another and always have been, and that we are reconciled to life, to created life, and always have been. Where this sense of separation came from, nobody knows. It came with Adamic consciousness, and but it's not true, and it's not something that we have to abide by. We can rebuke it. We can say no to it. And when we do this, we find ourselves um, realizing a much higher potential of human life because this is how we were created. We were created, as the Bible says, in the image of God. And that means that if we are in the image of God, we are certainly capable of being reconciled to God, of being one with God. We are one with God, and we always have been. So this is one thing that the Christ realizes. The Christ state breaks down this whole unconscious sense of separation and realizes the connection to God and the connection to life and one another that is our potential and always has been. That's one thing that the Christ realizes. The other thing is what happens in Adamic consciousness when we automatically uh, have as our instinctual orientation to life the position of operating out of human strength, out of the Darwinian mode of feeling like we're on our own, and so we have to fend for ourselves. That's also something that the Christ does away with, because when you do away with the sense of separation and no longer see yourselves as separate, there is no reason to operate out of this orientation of human strength. When we are connected, as the Christ is and realizes, um, to God and to one another and to universal created life, we don't need to fend for ourselves. We enter a kind of flow of life in which all of our needs are met without having to strive in that way. So that's another area in which the Christ basically does away with or reverses Adamic consciousness. And then the last and final area, it has to do with good and evil. And basically, the Christ overcomes, when it's any of us, overcomes the temptation of evil. And the Christ does not make evil disappear. Evil, the knowledge of good and evil, is here to stay for mankind. This knowledge was not a mistake. It was not something that we have to reverse and go back to the Garden of Eden pre-Adam. The knowledge of good and evil is not a bad thing. It's the temptation of evil that has been detrimental to mankind throughout this age. And basically, the Christ understands this and confronts evil on a level of saying, go ahead and tempt me, and I'm going to overcome each and every temptation to show you that even though you now exist as a flip side to good in the consciousness of man, we, mankind, all mankind that realizes the Christ, are capable of saying no to the temptation to invoke your power. And this is what the Christ does. And so we see a very good example of all this in one man, Jesus. And Jesus was not the only Christ. He was the embodiment of the Christ state of being, spiritual state, prior or first, um, before any of us, that we might have an example of what we can do and where we're heading as a species. And so we see very plainly in all the documentation we have about Jesus's life that he embodied all of these Christ attributes, that he broke the power or the binding sense of separation, that he shattered it, and that he realized oneness with God and oneness with all life and mankind. He shattered that, and then he shattered the instinctual illusion of having to fend for ourselves. He learned that this was not at all necessary, that simply by trusting and resting in God, all of our needs would be met. And he practiced that and showed us that it could be done. And finally, Jesus embodied this quality, this strength of being able to say no to evil. And he didn't just deny evil, he allowed evil to tempt him, but he overcame every temptation to reveal this truth that all men are capable of resisting evil, and that even though the knowledge of good and evil is not a bad thing and doesn't go away, but that human life is so much better when we do not invoke the power of evil, when we see it for what it is, and when we say no. When we say no, we are not going there. And this would change everything if people could do this same work that Jesus did and to become the Christ. And this would effectually change human life 100%. It would bring the new age of mankind, because this entire age has been characterized and boxed into the all that it means to be Adamic, all that it means to be subject to these aspects of Adamic consciousness that we've been talking about. But each one of us is capable of becoming the Christ. And that's what the new consciousness is all about. And that's what the Christ is. And we can do this. It's not a religion. It's not even a spiritual practice. It simply takes awareness, and it takes the strength to be able to say, is there another way than this Adamic quagmire that we've been in? Is there another way to view life? Is there another way to view myself? Do I have to be constrained by the sense of separation? Do I have to fend for myself? Do I have to be subject to the temptation of evil? And to realize as these things that uh, with Jesus are as our example that we don't need to do this anymore. So it's not a religious practice. It's simply a realization. It's simply self-realization um, about who we are as a creature, as a species, and what we're capable of. And then having the boldness to break out and to break those habitual patterns of behavior and thought that we've all been moving in, and to gain a vision for the Christ and for the new age, and then to move toward that in ourselves, in working on ourselves. And this is something we can all do, my friends, and it's going to be a new world when we do.